Hello, friends. Today I am joined by Katie Klein from Little House Learning Co., who is a wife, curriculum writer, and homeschooling mom to three in Minnesota. She is passionate about teaching biblical literacy, protecting childhood, and reading good books. I think I first started following you on Instagram, Katie, several years ago. You had a lot of fun reels and have enjoyed following you since then, not just for the fun, but for your thoughtful content, especially when it comes to homeschooling in the early years. So I'm really excited to have you here. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself, your family, and how you got started homeschooling?
Yeah, well, thanks for having me. This is such a fun conversation. Homeschooling is something that we have been doing now. We're going into our seventh year, I believe. It's kind of tricky depending on if you count preschool or not, but I do since we preschooled our youngest, or our oldest when he was in preschool. We homeschooled him. So yeah, I have three kids, live in Minnesota, like you said, and we've been here. I came to college here in Minnesota and have stayed ever since, and have just really enjoyed the homeschooling community that we have found here in the Twin Cities. It is something that I never expected necessarily to homeschool. It was something where when my oldest was a toddler, he was very chatty and kind of precocious, and people were like, "Oh, why didn't you enroll him in preschool?" And in Minnesota, preschool is very expensive. I know in some of our neighboring states they have free preschool programs and things like that, but not here. And so it was just something that I felt like I could do at home, where I was like, "Ooh, that's a ton of money. Maybe I could just try this at home since I was already a stay-at-home mom." And from there, really was exposed to this new kind of homeschooling that I had not seen when I was growing up in new homeschoolers, which was this Charlotte Mason approach that was really focused on truth and beauty and goodness and, worthy ideas. And that was something that really captured me at that age. And then from there, I just said, well, let's just see how preschool goes, and we'll send him off to kindergarten in 2020. And then we all know how that went. And so it was like, oh, maybe I guess we'll homeschool for kindergarten. And then here we are still homeschooling.
So you were introduced to Charlotte Mason ideas early on. Have you seen your approach to education or thoughts about homeschooling grow and change over the past few years?
I think that there's always growth and change that happens as you homeschool different ages, as you kind of go through those different thresholds of like, okay, I just have, that preschool kind of young age, and then it's kindergarten, and then it's that elementary age. And I hope that I'll continue to grow and learn, especially in my knowledge about homeschooling from a practical perspective, but also from the Charlotte Mason perspective. When I was first introduced to her, like I said, those ideas of like time outside and habit training and beautiful books it just resonated with me. I was someone who loved to read. I loved being outside. I spent all my summers at summer camp, that sort of thing. And as I've gotten to read through all of Charlotte Mason's volumes, I think the biggest change for me has just been really coming to understand more of her philosophy, and honestly just how little it has to do with homeschooling and how much it has to do with this wider perspective of parenting, of relying on the Holy Spirit, and the faith conversation of childhood brain development, just child development in general. There's so many things, as I read more of her words, get to know that better, I just see so many echoes in modern books on parenting and on technology use and all of these other things. There's just a lot that Charlotte Mason was really ahead of her time. And like I said, I hope that I continue to keep growing and learning more as we continue to homeschool.
And just seeing those connections, even with like, oh, this is a lot more than just the education, like homeschooling part. It's parenting and child development. A friend of
Mm-hmm.
mine, Lena Sutherland, has said that homeschooling is like parenting on steroids. And I think you
Yeah,
realize it's not just this sort of separate part of your child's life or your family life. It really is just parenting in a different way. And so all of these ideas play into one another for sure.
definitely.
Well, Katie, what have been some of your favorite parts of homeschooling?
I love this question because I feel like the more we homeschool, the longer our list grows. But our primary reason for homeschooling was just doing life together. we have a family value of just togetherness, of why do alone what you can do together. And homeschooling for us just resonated with these values my husband and I already had. It was what we saw for the benefit of our family. So obviously being together is the best part and also the worst part sometimes. Because it's a double-edged sword of like, yeah, it would be so nice to have my house quiet and be alone for 4 hours a day or 8 hours a day while my kids were off at school or whatever. But it is really genuinely the best part of homeschooling. And then of course you go down just the litany of lists of just it provides my kids a one-on-one education. It is something that really benefits their physical health, where they're able to sleep as long as they need and eat when they're hungry and use the bathroom when they need, and all of these things. I think ultimately, sorry, this is going to be a long answer, but I think ultimately, like when we look as adults of like what would be our ideal life, it's like no boss, flexible schedule, able to travel when I want, all this freedom. And then you look at that and you're like, well, I can't give my kids that life in adulthood necessarily, but I certainly could give it to them in childhood. And I feel like that's what homeschooling does for us, is it gives my kids this life that is kind of the ideal that everyone's working towards, of just freedom and flexibility, freedom to be themselves, freedom to play, freedom to pursue their interests, all these different things.
Oh, I love that idea. It makes me think of, in the classical world, we call it restful learning or scole, and that being sort of
Mm-hmm.
this ideal of the end of education, or how it's just a part of a good human life, and that we get to give that to our children. We can't control their future boss
Right.
situation, but we can give them that in childhood. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Well, how about some of the challenges? I assume you have faced some, even in this, magical, wonderful world of homeschooling.
Yes. Yes. I mean, far and away, it is that being together, but really it's the parenting piece. Like I would just love sometimes to have a break from parenting. If I could just homeschool and not have to parent my kids as well, like that would be a cinch. It's
Right?
not actually the homeschooling part, but it is the constant grind of parenting in conjunction with homeschooling, because we are together. And it is the more than that, like the requirement of me to become less selfish, more selfless, as I lay down my priorities, the way that I wish that the day would go for my child who maybe has a need or a preference, where I'm saying, well, I would love to be, on the treadmill and getting my hair done, or like whatever, like these different things. I would love to orchestrate my day where it wasn't constant interruptions, and kids who have needs and need me to shepherd them in those scenarios. But because we choose homeschooling, we are just doing life together. And that comes, like I said, with so many gifts and benefits, but also it requires more of me as the mother, and it requires more of me and more of my time and more of my active parenting.
Yeah, I think so often with homeschooling or just parenting in general, there's all of this humiliation that comes in the process of being
Mm,
made more humble. And
yes.
it's dying to self, right? It's a repentance.
Yes.
I think I mean, I am very blessed with my husband and I just celebrated our 20th anniversary this past
Oh,
summer. And
congratulations.
thank you. And, marriage can be hard sometimes, but I've been very blessed with a
Mm-hmm.
wonderful marriage. But I think parenting has done more to show me my need for Jesus, than
Yes.
anything
Yes.
else. And that is very painful at times. That is
Yeah.
not always
Yes.
fun, but that's also really good. And when we're
Yes.
homeschooling as well, we get all of that times 10 or times 100, right?
Right. Right.
So many opportunities to see how incapable
Mm-hmm.
we are, how much we don't know, but how much we can rely on Jesus. So,
Totally. And I mean, honestly, I could fool myself into believing I was a much better parent if I wasn't homeschooling and with my kids, like for a majority of the day. And so it is a constant need for me to come before Jesus and just say, okay, I need you like every hour, Lord, to come and help me, equip me for this job. You've given me these kids to shepherd and to love, and we've chosen this pathway that I think is really a benefit to them. And so I need you know, I need the Holy Spirit to help me and guide me as we homeschool, which is really just like you said, parenting on steroids.
well, Katie, one of the reasons why I wanted to especially talk with you on this season was you share a lot of encouragement and tips and ideas about homeschooling in the early years. So I wanted to just kind of talk to you about this topic and ask how you think we ought to think about and approach the early years of education. And if there are particular things, let's just start sort of the preschool years. Are there particular things we ought to be prioritizing as homeschool parents?
Yeah, it's interesting. I actually was reading in Home Education with Charlotte Mason. My husband and I are going through that book together, where she was talking about how little we value the personhood of young children, to the point where in her time and culture, they would have these nannies who were, maybe gruff and kind of older, or these women who were maybe not well educated, and that was who the child spent most of their time with. In my mind, just looking at that little years, how much we think like, oh, they're just these little kids we can brush to the side, we can give them something that's mediocre instead of really the best. But I think when we look at kids at that age, they are capable of so much more than we give them credit for, and they are whole people, like, who are worthy of us honoring them and their personhood, and us seeing them for who they are, not trying to shape them or mold them into who we want them to be. And I think for me in the little years, because I just think they're so special and really a unique time of childhood where kids are growing into these, it's almost miraculous as you watch a child age, even from like 2 to 6. You're like, wow, every year they are such a different child, but so much the same. They have grown and learned so much, that I just love this age group. And for me, we try to focus on 4 things. One being spending lots of time outside, getting the child well acquainted with the world around them, with the natural beauty, and just wonder. We don't need to be making sensory bins for our children. Like, the outdoors is all like so much sensory input for a child. And it is a way to connect with, God is our creator. It's a way to develop a healthy body. There's so many benefits to being outside. The second thing would be focusing on habit training. And for me, like, when most people in the modern world hear the word habit training, they're like, what in the world? But I like to say, like, habit training and life skills, because that translates a lot more to like our modern vernacular. So, helping kids learn how to be like a part of your family, to have productive work, to give them purpose, and have them learn to help. That age, you have kids who are 2, 3, 4, 5, and everything you're doing, they just want to be right by you. They're your little shadows. They're like, can I help? Can I do it? Like, me do it. Like, me do it. That's what you always hear. And so to really give kids some of that equipping with life skills, but also with habit training. So working on the habit of obedience, working on truthfulness, working on attentiveness, being able to grow their like attention span through reading together. So the third thing really is connected to that, and that's living books. Giving your child the best of literature, spending lots of time reading. There's been so much research done out there on just how much reading aloud impacts a child. It impacts their brain development. It impacts their familial connections and relationship. It impacts the way that they're able to, see the world through different lenses and have empathy and compassion. I mean, there's just so much out there on data on why reading aloud is beneficial. So outdoor time, habit training, living books. And then my fourth one is just delaying formal education. And what I mean by that is being able to have a child who you are maybe exploring letters and numbers, but you're doing it in a way that, like I said, is honoring the child's personhood. So it's their pace, it's their tempo, and being patient with that, where you're not forcing them to sit down and do all these worksheets and coloring pages. And I could go on a whole tangent about worksheets, because you're really, when you can't read, most worksheets are just for the parent to say, look what we did, look at all the progress. It's like a marker for the instructor to say, oh, look at all this that they've done. But especially for kids who are in preschool, it's mostly just cutting and pasting and coloring. And there's so much more to education than that. So it's delaying that formal piece of sitting down and doing table work and kind of having it be pressureful and like, you will learn this, you will write this, and letting the child be who they are, which some kids at that age, they're excited. They want to learn all their letters. They want to learn to read. They're just like gung-ho. And then there's other kids that are really stressed by that. And they are they want to play, they want to do their own thing. They maybe are curious enough if you're doing like a fun little activity together, but they don't want to, they have no interest in school. So really finding that balance, which is a lot harder, you know, with anything. It's so much easier to be on one side or the other, nothing, all or nothing. It's the balance that's a lot trickier.
Yeah, definitely. And I think sometimes people hear like delaying formal education and they think that means you're not teaching your child anything, which I think I love
Right.
that we were making the distinction between like worksheets, you know, some sort of
Mm-hmm.
external measurable sign that we could point to and be like, look what we've done versus more organic learning in those early years. And I've seen in my own children, you know, all five of them, very different, ready for different kinds of ideas at different stages, but all
Totally.
of them when they were very young, like you're able to teach them, you know, numerical thinking and literary
Mm-hmm.
thinking and giving them
Mm-hmm.
these pre-reading skills without ever having to use a curriculum or any kind of formal
Right.
learning, right? And it doesn't mean
Right.
you're keeping them from learning about numbers or you're keeping them from even learning about gasp addition and subtraction or whatever. But
Yes.
you're just doing it
Yes.
in a way that fits your normal life as they're working beside you, as you're reading and exploring together.
Totally.
But then eventually we do have to transition into, you know, more formal learning. So how do we know when it's appropriate to transition to more formal education and when might that happen maybe differently for different kids?
Yeah, I do think it is very different for every kid because you want to take where they're at. And so, like in my preschool curriculum, we do a lot of just playful learning. But you can do, like, for example, like you'll play a little math activity and it's very hands-on. It feels like a game. It doesn't feel like school. And you can do that anywhere from just one like number recognition all the way up to, you know, beginner addition problems, depending on where your child is at. So when it comes to that formal like education, I think sometimes it really, you have to kind of step back and define what do you mean by formal education. So for me, formal education includes narration. It includes more table time, I call it, like in our homeschool, where they're sitting down and doing more writing or any kind of like worksheet type, you know, whether you're doing like a math lesson or copy work or things like that, where you're at the table working. To me, that is a formal education, or even formal education is having like, here's our schedule. These are the things we want to accomplish. Like, we're going to introduce you to books that you might not love, but they're part of our curriculum, and we're going to, you know, explore this together. Whereas like the years before that, it's just like, hey, are you interested? Are you not? Letting the child be in this quiet growing kindergarten or quiet growing time, as Charlotte Mason says. So, I think that, you know, for many kids that can be, there's a wide kind of sliding range of when they're ready for that formal education. But for me, especially like narration, we do not do until the child is in first grade, which is usually like 6, 7 range. But I have a quiet growing kindergarten, my kindergarten curriculum, that is really focused on that 5, 6 year old. And there's a huge range of what kids are ready for. So sometimes it's just taking your child as they are, you know, setting up some activities and things, seeing how they're interested and letting them, like I said, set the pace, letting them define when they're ready. And that's going to be different for every child.
So, kind of as a distinction from maybe the earliest preschool years, and then we have
Mm-hmm.
first grade, maybe 6, 7. So, we have this sort of middle transition period.
Yes.
What would you see as some of the key components of a living education for what we might traditionally think of as kindergarten?
Yeah, well, I still see kindergarten as part of that quiet growing time, that young kind of informal schooling age. But I also feel like they need something more than maybe just play outside and read books. And so for me, for my kids, you know, I'm going to have my third kindergartner this year, and I've written a kindergarten curriculum, like I mentioned. That looks like being able to bridge the gap between first grade, which is kind of like, here's your structure and here's your, you know, narration and here's, you know, all like this table work, and preschool, which is like, let's go to the bakery and like, let's like read these picture books and let's do these little like craftings and work on, you know, learning to sweep and wipe the counters, you know, or whatever. So it's this time in between where you're helping to bridge that huge chasm, making your child more aware of, hey, this is a little lesson instead of an activity, if that makes sense. And maybe that's obscure, maybe that's like not, maybe that's super subjective, but for me, that's how I see it, as like preschool is very, very playful. First grade is much less playful. And so what can we do in this in between time to help really prepare your child, but also still retain so much of that time and space for them to play, where most of the day is still free play and theirs to choose what they want to do.
What would you think that would look like practically on a daily basis? Like, what does that include? Do you think maybe there are ideas that people think you would be including that you're not, or that you wouldn't, that you are?
I mean, for me, in my kindergarten, that includes like really like introducing them to the world of poetry and to science and geography, but doing that at an appropriate level. So like for science, we start in our backyard and we learn about the animals and the plants that are growing in our backyard, and then we expand it to maybe the woods or the ponds that are in our area. Same with geography. It starts very much with like basic concepts where you're not like sitting down, and there are some kids at that age who are memorizing, all of the continents and all of the states, and that's fine if that's like your vibe. There's nothing wrong with that. But for me, it is this introductory level where you're showing them these subjects are beautiful, they are rich, they are fun. I'm excited to learn with you. This is it's kind of it's almost like training for a marathon, where you're like, the marathon is hard and it's going to come when, like these formal years, like I'm sure when you're looking at 10th grade algebra, it looks very like kindergarten seems like nothing, so you get some of these more cultured or more experienced homeschoolers who are like, oh, kindergarten, you can't do kindergarten wrong. Don't do anything. Your kid's fine. But then you have these parents who are first-time homeschoolers, or whose state requires kindergarten. They're like, but what do I do? Like, I'm so lost. And so for me, it is being able to, like I said, introduce these beautiful ideas where your child is having getting their feet wet with history and with nature journaling and definitely with the Bible, lots of scripture, with folk songs and with handicrafts and things like that, but it's still age appropriate. It's not this upper level formalized learning.
Well, because we're kind of training their affections, obviously, like, right? Like we're helping
Mm-hmm.
them learn to love the things that are lovely and to believe the things that are true. And I
Yeah.
think about this like Shakespeare is a big part of our homeschool just because it's something I love. And so I just have decided
Yeah.
to trick all my children into loving it too. But the thing that I love about including Shakespeare, even with my young learners, we just do it all together as a family, is they just always have thought of themselves as people who love Shakespeare. Like that's just a thing
Mm.
in our family. Like Sloanes love Shakespeare. And so it's
Cute.
not something when they're later on, maybe having to learn how to analyze it more or approach it in a different way. It's not scary or like boring. It's like,
Mm-hmm.
oh no, yeah, like I've been doing Shakespeare since I was 2. It's fine. And I
Totally.
think that can
Totally.
be true for a lot of these topics or subjects,
Mm-hmm.
maybe if we can call them that. Like in those early years when you're first introducing your children to these ideas, it's like when you get to capture their imagination, right? Like, oh, you're going to
Mm-hmm.
love this. This is great. In our family, like we just get really into nature study, like you were saying, or whatever it
Yeah,
is,
totally.
even for your family. Like you're like, oh, you're going to love it. You're going to love it. And later on, it'll be
Yeah.
harder. Maybe they won't always love it, but
Yeah.
it's really a sweet time of childhood.
Mm-hmm. And honestly, so much of kindergarten is even for the parent, especially for the first time homeschooling kindergarten parent. It's learning, how do I like put a schedule together? How do I teach these subjects? What does this mean for my family? How do I do this? Like, for me, it was a huge jump between staying at home and homeschooling. There's a big difference for me, especially the farther we got into homeschooling. It was like, oh, I thought this was going to be just like when I was a stay-at-home mom, but now I have all these extra responsibilities and things I'm teaching. And so sometimes it's even just more for the parent to say, okay, how do I learn how to be a homeschooling parent?
Yeah, that's a really good point too. I think my friend Dawn Garrett, Lady Dusk, she talks about like using those early years really as a time to start getting your own education. Like if you feel like as a mom,
Mm-hmm.
your education was lacking, or maybe you want to dive more deeply into some of these, Charlotte Mason volumes or whatever
Mm-hmm.
educational books that you want to start learning, you have a lot more time to kind of start thinking about those ideas yourself as the mom.
Yeah,
Um, while
totally.
maybe the homeschooling education part is a little less time consuming.
Definitely.
Well, Katie, this has been great. I know it's going to encourage many moms of young learners. But before we wrap up, I want to ask you the questions I'm asking all my guests this season. And so the
Yeah.
first is just, what are you reading lately?
So I read a lot. I have read over 100 books already this year, which is the most I've ever read in a year, but it's because I set a challenge for myself that I really wanted to read down my bookshelf. My bookshelves keep expanding as I'm picking up books at, thrift stores and book sales. And I'll pick up titles that somebody, has recommended or that's on a book list. And then I don't know what's in it. So then my oldest is getting to the point where he's much more independent in his reading. He's saying, "Hey mom, what should I read next?" And I'm like, well, I've heard that this book is good for your age group, but I don't really know. And so I've been reading down my bookshelf, and that has been super fun. I spend a lot of time then in like children's chapter books. I've been reading through, especially the Betsy Tacy series. Have you heard of it?
Yes,
By
yes.
Maud Hart Lovelace.
Uh-huh.
Yes. So I'm about like 6 or 7 books into that series, and that has been so fun. It takes place in Minnesota. So it's just so special. My family went and saw the Betsy Tacy houses in Mankato, where the author lived, and she lived across the street from the girl who represents Tacy in the series. So that was really special. So reading the series has been fun for me, but there's a lot of gems in those chapter books, and as I've been pre-reading for the upper years of our curriculum, I'm just finding so many things that I enjoy, and I'm like, oh, now I know why it was on all those book lists. Now I know why everyone recommended it, because it's wonderful. So that's been fun.
That sounds really fun. Yeah, it's really a delight to get to sometimes just go to a children's book that you had never read before. I just recently, well, within this past year, I had never read the Half Magic series by Edward Eger.
Okay.
And I've been reading it out loud with my youngest son, and it is an absolute delight. I was like, how did I go through childhood without reading this? And I read a ton of classics growing up. Like I was very well
Okay.
read, I thought, but there's always more, and it's so much fun to discover that new gem and then get
Yes.
to share it with your kids.
Well, and I'm the opposite of you. I did not read any classical books growing up. I never even read Narnia or anything like that until I was an adult. So it's been really fun to go back and read all of these series. It's just been like I have that feeling literally once a week where I'm like, oh, this book, this is so great. It's so fun. So
That is so fun. And, a really good children's book, of course, is worth reading as an adult. It's not just for children. So I'm almost
definitely.
jealous that you
Yeah.
got to have the experience of reading Narnia for the first time.
Yeah. It's fun.
Got
It
to
was
keep
fun.
reading it. Yeah. All right. The final question I have for you, Katie, is what would be your best tip for dealing with a homeschool day or maybe a homeschool season that seems to be going all wrong?
Well, I think I have two. One comes from Nancy Kelly. It's a phrase she uses a lot. I don't know if you're familiar with Nancy. She's from Minnesota. She's a Charlotte Mason mom, and she says, keep cutting back until there's peace in your home. And I just think that is always something I put in the back of my mind of like, is there peace? Are we prioritizing this connection over curriculum? And is our home a place of peace? And so in every season, that's going to look different. And then I think one that cannot be understated is just the power of prayer. I think that sometimes we think of prayer as a last resort, or it's like, oh yeah, prayer. Oh yeah, and prayer. But I think it is incredibly important. Too important not to pray. Like our homeschooling is so much. We need, like I was saying too, we depend on the Lord and the Holy Spirit so much that we just shouldn't put off prayer. Prayer should be our number one go-to when we're feeling like things are falling apart.
Yeah, that is very wise words. Katie, thank you so much for chatting with us today. Can you let
Thank
people know
you.
where they can find you all around the internet?
Yeah, so on Instagram, my handle is Little House Learning Co. And that's also my blog, littlehouselearningco.com. And those are the two places that I show up the most, so they can find me there. And then my DMs are always open if people have questions. And that's where my blog is where you can find my shop and all my curriculum and things like that too.
Perfect. I will have links to your Instagram and your website in the show notes for this episode over at humilityanddoxology.com. Thank you to everyone who is listening or watching. If you would share this episode with a friend that you know who is homeschooling in the little years so she can be encouraged, that would be terrific. If you're watching on YouTube, please make sure that you subscribe so you don't miss the rest of the homeschool conversations this season. And if you're listening in your podcast app, you can leave a rating and review, which would be great. Thank you, Katie. I will chat with you more later.
Yeah, thank you.